dear students of 8A and 8B to my history class. Teaching as per the syllabus of first unit test is completed. Now the process of revision is being started. In my first lesson of revision, I am going to analyze all the points for your better understanding. Lesson number Transition to the Modern Era. Now I am going to discuss. Please look at it, and if you have any problem, ask me in the live class. Now what is here? Transition to the modern era. In this lesson, what is the basic concept of the lesson? Transition to the modern era. If you want to learn the basic concept of this lesson, then you have to understand the concrete definition of history. What is history? What is history? What is the concrete definition of history? The concrete definition of history is studying the changing patterns of the society, studying the changing events of society or age is known as history. Studying the changing patterns of the society, studying the changing facts and incidents of history, different countries of the world is known as history. To make the study of history easy and effective, the historians have divided the past into three periods. Number one, ancient. Number two, medieval. And number three, modern. Ancient, medieval and modern. The transition and this ancient, medieval and modern, as per the conveniences of the historians, they have divided they divided the past history into three periods: ancient, medieval and modern. Now, what is ancient period, what is medieval period, and what is modern period? Ancient period means from a primitive stage, the period when society moves from a primitive state towards a more advanced state is known as the transitional period of history. And the medieval period in Europe, ancient period means the period where the old traditional beliefs and faiths were practiced. There was no proper knowledge of the people. People were dominated by upper class people. Lower people, means common people, were dominated by the upper class people. Those who were rich, educated, they dominated the lower class people. Besides, there was no education, no culture. But in course of time, during Vedic age, one system of education was introduced among the learners under the special care of the Brahmins. They taught sitting under a tree in the open air and taught their disciples. That system is known as Gurukul system of education. That system was followed during ancient period. But in course of time, that system also was changed, and a new system, came, new system formed among them. The concept of modern education, modern system of education. And medieval period, what is medieval period? The medieval period, in European history lasted from 5th century to 15th century IE, means a millennium. It was a period of social, political turmoil. The people of Europe suffered a lot during this period from calamities like plague, like famines, etc., etc. The Catholic Church, moreover, the Catholic Church dominated Europeans. Moreover, the Catholic Church dominated the common people, dominated the realms of arts, education, and politics. It was around this time that the people began to question the age-old beliefs, the age-old practices followed by the church for the past few centuries. This phase marked the beginning of the transition of era from medieval period to the modern period. The study of transition, my dear students, is very important as it helps us to understand the basic concept, the reasons behind the decline of the old traditional system, old periods, and old emergence of the new periods. It helps us to understand the reasons behind the decline of the old periods and the emergence of new periods or modern periods. The modern period began at different times in different parts of the world. In Europe, it started in the 15th century, but in India, it is said that the modern period started in India. The modern period began with the advent of the British in India. With the advent of the British in India. In India, modern period began with the advent of the British. It is said. Now, what are the sources of history? What are the sources of history? What are the sources of history? Sources of history. What are the sources of history? You know, there are some sources of history. What is it? Number one, there are two sources of history. Primary sources and secondary sources. For better understanding, the historians divided the past, as I mentioned earlier, into three periods: ancient, medieval, and modern. But the developments of a particular period, from ancient to the modern periods helps us to understand with certain materials. That's why the historians, especially the archaeologists, discovered a number of points, artifacts, manuscripts, and from these materials, the historians, came to know the past history of the world from time to time. And not only that, the historians classified these two groups into primary and secondary. Now, this is about the sources of history. Now, what is primary sources? Primary sources. What is primary sources? Primary sources. What are primary sources? Now I am going to discuss. Oh, there is no electricity. Anyway, there is no electricity. Please look at the blackboard and try to understand the concepts the basic points which I am explaining you. What are primary sources? Primary sources mean official records, books, headlines, buildings, artifacts, photographs, coins, autobiographies. These are the important documents which are used by the historians and use it as source of history. These sources of history is known as primary sources. And now secondary sources. Secondary sources. Now I am going to discuss about secondary sources. This is about primary sources. And now secondary sources. What is secondary sources? Secondary sources. Secondary sources are the sources of history includes. Secondary sources are the sources of history include accounts of a period that are recorded by historians from time to time who already have studied the primary sources, and then they have recorded necessary accounts for their better understanding, and these interpretations of the historians constitute secondary sources and are found as reports, journals, reviews, books, etc., etc. So these are secondary sources. Now, transition to the modern era means transition to the modern medieval period to the modern period. Transition from the medieval period to the modern period. Transition from medieval to the modern period. Transition from medieval to the modern period. Now, how was it possible? Now I am going to discuss. Sometimes during medieval period, during the middle of the 14th century, certain events took place like decline of medieval feudalism, the rise of new cities and trade centers, and developments in the field of trade and commerce, along with science and art, and it became evident in Europe. It was a natural activities of the people. These events brought in changes that were so radical that they can be said to have begun a new period. And these changes which took place during that period marked the transition of Europe from medieval period to the modern period. So during this period, medieval to modern period, this period is referred to as the transition from the medieval period to the modern period. Now, what are the hallmarks of the modern period? There are certain hallmarks of the modern period. There are certain characteristic features of the modern period. These characteristic features are growth of democracy or democratic institutions, and industrialization, urbanization, trade and colonization, questioning established religious traditions, and rationalism and humanism. That means with the advent of a new era, after the age of Renaissance, when people began to question about the wrong and old traditional practices of the Catholic Church, about feudal lords, against feudal lords, there came a complete change in the entire society of Europe, entire society of different countries of Europe. As a result, a new concept also gave a birth, it gave a birth of a new concept, that is Renaissance. This meaning, the meaning of Renaissance means rebirth, that began in Italy in the 14th century and then spread all over Europe. This movement means this Renaissance witnessed a new era, witnessed a series of new developments in the fields of art, in the fields of architecture, in the fields of science, in the fields of literature, in the fields of paintings, in the field of sculpture. This new development took place during this period, and here the church, which had been independently dominating common people, their their influence over common people also was declining during the age of Renaissance. Another important thing that is another characteristic feature of the age of Renaissance, that is fall of Constantinople. Fall of Constantinople. Now I am going to discuss fall of Constantinople. Fall of Constantinople. What is this? Constantinople, Constantinople was a great center of art and learning. Constantinople was a great center of art and learning. But this very place, Constantinople was captured by the Turks in the year 1453. This center of knowledge of the Roman Empire, Constantinople, came under the influence of Ottoman Turks, and it gave a birth of a new age, a new concept, that was Renaissance. Many Greek scholars left Constantinople and reach Italy for shelter. As a result, the universities of Florence, Milan, Venice in Italy became important centers of education. An important feature of the Renaissance was the rise of literacy. People learned to read and write not only Latin but also other vernacular languages. This was the time which saw the emergence of the great universities of Oxford, Cambridge, Naples, etc., etc. The spread of knowledge created a new era, a new kind of thinking, a new kind of ideology, a new kind of concepts. The Renaissance reached its highest extent in the 16th century in the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, Milan, and Bologna and Rome. Among all the factors responsible for the Renaissance, the print revolution made a major impact throughout Europe. The invention of the printing press around 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg made books available to the people, and people were able to gain knowledge by reading books. Books were not available earlier, but as soon as this printing press was discovered by the famous personality of the world, Johannes Gutenberg, one German, then the handwritten manuscripts, which were there earlier, very hard to understand. Most of the handwritten manuscripts had become deciphered, and it was also expensive to learn, expensive to purchase. And after the invention of the printing press, people were able to purchase books at low costs. By 1500 AD, there were around 1,000 printers in Europe, and books such as the Bible, Latin and Greek classics, legal documents, legal handbooks, and books on philosophy also were printed. These increased the desire for knowledge. This increased the thirst for knowledge among the Europeans. Now, what are the impacts of Renaissance? Now, I am going to discuss about the impacts of the Renaissance. What are the impacts of the Renaissance? Impacts of the Renaissance. What are the impacts of the Renaissance? Now I am going to discuss my questions. What are the impacts of the Renaissance? There are certain impacts of the Renaissance. What are these impacts? Now I am going to discuss. First one, people started reading books. People started reading books written by a number of scholars, and started asking questions and evaluate the values and norms that were followed by the church. They began to use their power of reason, and they question about the old traditional beliefs and practices of the Catholic Church. That's why they came out of these superstitions. The old traditional beliefs and superstitions which influenced, which dominated, which degraded their lifestyle. They could not understand which was right, which was wrong, which should be done, which should not be done. They didn't have any knowledge. Right that moment, the age of Renaissance encouraged them to study. They started purchasing books. Meanwhile, the new concept they gave the concept of Renaissance gave a birth of a new concept: learning, studying materials. Meanwhile, Johannes Gutenberg discovered the printing press, and published so many books of different types, Bibles, classics, and so on. This helped the people to learn unknown things. They started reading it because it came under their grip, because its prices also are very less. That's why they began to use their power of reason and started questioning the existing beliefs, the old traditional beliefs, the blind faith and superstitions. Rationalism and the need to question brought about a change in thinking of the masses. They started believing that everything has a reason and everybody has a right to reason and question. They refused to accept anything blindly, what they practiced earlier, even the authority of the church. The words of notable Italian Renaissance writers like Dante, Petrarca, Boccaccio, Machiavelli, Aristotle encourage intellectual thinkings by their articles written. From time to time, the common people, on receiving knowledge, they started studying their materials written by these distinguished people of Europe: Machiavelli, Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarca. Their articles encourage them a lot. They encourage their intellectual thinking, which led to an increase in people's desire to gain better knowledge. Naturally, their thirst for knowledge also was increased among them. In the medieval period, everything revolved around religion. The medieval period, it was a period of political turmoil, political instability. That's why during that period, during medieval period, everything revolved around the religion. People were taught not to think about the material world, but to concentrate on God. During medieval period it happened. However, The Renaissance thinkers believed that human life in this world was of great importance, and they came to be known as humanists. Who raised that question that human life in this world was of great importance? Only the humanists. The humanists said it. They were humanists because they shifted the focus from godly affairs to human affairs. They shifted the focus from godly affairs to human affairs, and humans became the center of study during this period as human form became the prime subject of painting and sculpture. The paintings and statues were lifelike. The true spirit of Renaissance encouraged them, encouraged the painters, encouraged the sculptors, and they showed their talents, like Leonardo da Vinci, like Michelangelo, like Donatello, like Raphael. They created the great masterpieces during that period, during that time. During 16th century, what happened? The 16th century also witnessed a new era, advancement in the field of science and technology, and discoveries of astronomers like Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo, and Sir Isaac Newton. They directly oppose to the views held by the church that the earth was the center of the universe. The earth was the center of the universe, which was absolutely wrong. They strongly opposed it. These discoveries challenged the traditional beliefs which shook the foundations of whom? Foundations of society, and then it gave a birth of a new concept, new outlook among the people, and the invention of different instruments like telescope, like microscope. It also revealed new wonders. It also increased the power of thinking, the power of expression, the power of expression. Scholars sought scientific explanations of things around them. They based their study on the formula of observation and experimentation and conclusion finally. People were infused with the spirit of inquiry. They began to question set notions and explore the unknown things. And this resulted in the discovery of new lands, the discovery of new sea routes, establishment of international trading relations with other countries of the world, and the introduction of gunpowder from the Arabian sides, also of great importance, because the Arabian gunpowder had become so useful in small guns that the old long bows, the old crossbows, these all were completely disappeared. People started using only the gunpowder discovered by the Arabs. It broke the hold of the feudal lords on the peasants and common people. Not only that, forts were no longer, it also led to the rise of modern nation states, only because of the new age, the age of Renaissance. Up to this, my dear student, next day, the remaining points will be re-explained during my revision class. Up to this, thank you.